Creating one great gimmick is a hard enough thing for a wrestler to do. After all, there's a whole graveyard of failed characters out there. So creating two gimmicks and portraying them at the same time? Well, that's the mark of a real talent. But what are the biggest examples of this happening in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with one of the greatest dual gimmicks of all time, and that's Bray Wyatt's Fiend and Firefly Funhouse Jekyll and Hyde-like characters. Yes, as more time goes on following his tragic death, it's becoming clearer and clearer just how much of a fantastic creative mind we all lost when Bray Wyatt sadly departed from this world. Hell, he was so good, he was able to repeatedly overcome some pretty questionable booking decisions of Vince McMahon. How did he do this? Well, by constantly reinventing himself. That's right, it didn't matter if it was Husky Harris, the Bayou cult leader, the man being haunted by the mysterious Uncle Howdy, or arguably his finest creation. Every time WWE creative knocked him down, he just came right back with something even better. And that finest creation was, of course, the dual roles of the Fiend and the Mr. Rogers-style Firefly Funhouse occupant, with these characters appearing to represent the dual aspects of Bray's psyche. On one hand, we had a lovable children's show host who wanted nothing more than to heal the world with good vibes and smiles. And on the other hand, we had a nightmarish horror movie monster whose only goal was to hurt everyone around him in the most vicious of ways. Really, we're probably going to look back on this one in years to come and realize just how ahead of its time it was, as even now, the Firefly Funhouse match at WrestleMania 36 stands as something worthy of endless dissection and discussion. And what's more, there's so much that was still left to do with the gimmick as well, which makes it all the sadder that the entire thing was butchered so badly with times like Hell in a Cell 2019 or the Burnt Fiend of late 2020 and early 2021. Still, at least we did get a lot of great times out of this period too, and maybe that's the best way to remember it now, for how well Bray Wyatt balanced those two sides of himself. And as it happens, he wasn't the only person wielding dual gimmicks at this time either, as during the same period, another hellacious alter ego of a popular superstar was presenting itself to audiences in the tale of Finn Balor and the Demon. But then, this one goes all the way back to Finn's early days working in places like Japan and the UK Indies, as there was always an element of him using body paint in order to transform himself for a big bout. Obviously though, once he signed with WWE in 2014, this body-painted version took on a formal name, and that name was the Demon. Yes, well, for the most part, whenever we saw the Irishman appear on TV, he was wrestling as himself. On occasion, whenever a tough challenge came along, he'd call upon his darker side and channel this into his final form, with such a form almost never failing to get the job done. Hell, it was the Demon that helped him to become not only a two-time NXT World Champion, but the inaugural Universal Champion as well. And it was the Demon who helped him to score big-time wins over a host of opponents. That said, since losing to both Roman Reigns and Edge, it appears this side of Balor has gone into hibernation, as he's instead chosen to focus on his Prince character, with that being a callback to the old days when he went by the name of Prince Devitt. Will the Demon return again at some point in the future? We've got no doubt that he will, but only when Finn needs him most, perhaps during a time when the Judgment Day are in disarray and in need of something to pull them out of their funk. One person who never needed their alter ego to pull them out of a funk, however, is our next subject. Why is that? Well, because he was a superhero. Yes, it's time to talk about the mystery of the Hurricane and ace reporter Gregory Helms. Now, we all know the story of Caped Crusaders and their secret other lives. After all, who amongst us isn't familiar with Batman and Bruce Wayne, Spider-Man and Peter Parker, or Superman and Clark Kent? Hell, usually these apparently innocent bystanders have some indirect connection with the hero, like Parker taking photos of the web crawler for the Daily Bugle or Kent writing stories on the Man of Tomorrow for the Daily Planet. So when a wrestling superhero comes along like the Hurricane did in the early to mid 2000s, then anyone wanting to figure out their true identity should only have to look to those who are closest to them. And that was why there was a lot of suspicion placed on ace reporter Gregory Helms when he began appearing on ECW TV in 2009, with him usually appearing and then disappearing right before the crime fighter showed up. Does this mean that the two were one and the same? That's certainly what many fans believed, and it's certainly what many roster members felt as well. But like in the cases of Mr. America and Hulk Hogan, or El Generico and Sami Zayn, such rumors should be taken with a pinch of salt, as there's no hard evidence to prove any of the theories going around. But let's say for argument's sake, Gregory Helms and the Hurricane were the same man. That would make what he was doing at this point all the more impressive, as not only would it mean he was juggling multiple gimmicks at once and still maintaining a healthy win-loss record, but he was also managing to pull the wool over the eyes of many in the process. Really, it would be a career achievement for the North Carolina native, which could only be beaten by the time he scored a pinfall win over The Rock in early 2003. And it would also be an example of one of the better times someone had carried out a Jekyll and Hyde style ability to play two characters simultaneously. So, for that reason, we kind of hope this is one theory which is true. And it's not the only theory about two characters being played by the same person that we hope is true, because we feel exactly the same way about Ezekiel and Elias. Yes, we know Kevin Owens is already convinced of this theory, and we're sure he's managed to convince a bunch of you as well. But some remain unclear as to the truth behind what was happening on 2022 Raw, when after years of seeing the Drifter Elias show up and play a few tunes on his guitar in order to rile up fans, he suddenly disappeared from TV and was replaced by what we were told was his twin brother Ezekiel. Sure, they looked exactly the same, enough to where a lot of fans smelled something fishy about the whole situation. But they couldn't have actually been the same person, because Elias has a beard and Ezekiel was clean shaven. And then of course there was the segment where the two appeared on screen together in a backstage pre-tape. Yes, many have argued that this was done through simple special effects, the kind that have been available since the 80s, but you don't really think WWE would lie to us, do you? No, for as much as we've included it in this video just in case, we're inclined to believe that Elias and Ezekiel were actually two different people, and that if they'd ever been given a chance to appear in the ring together in tag, they could have completely dominated the division in short order. Hell, who knows? After that was over, they might have even been able to start a New York Trios division with their younger brother Elrod if he'd decided to lace up his own boots after seeing the success his siblings were having. Of course, if we're wrong and it was all nothing more than a ruse, then we do have to give props to Jeffrey Ciulo, the man behind the whole thing, as it would mean he had pulled off quite an achievement by taking what should have been a dead-on-arrival late-period Vince McMahon comedy gimmick and turned it into something pretty entertaining. Certainly far more entertaining than anyone could have imagined it would be. But it wouldn't be the only highly entertaining Jekyll and Hyde style comedy gimmick WWE ever managed to put into the world, if it is indeed a case of one man playing two, as back in 2009, an even better one was happening with Santino and Santina, the Marella siblings. That's right, we all remember Santino Marella, probably the most legitimately funny comedy character in WWE history not named R-Truth. Hell, he gave us some of the most laugh-out-loud segments ever seen inside a wrestling ring, such as he and Vladimir Kozlov's tea party for Sheamus in 2010, or the time he introduced the Honkameter during his attempts to do a Gunther and beat the Honky Tonk Man's Intercontinental title reign record. What some may have forgotten today, though, is that for a brief period at the end of the 2000s, we were actually introduced to an up until then unseen sister of Santino, with this performer going by the name of Santina. Yes, this one was clearly an example of the kayfabe Italian trying to get himself inserted into a bout he had no right to be in when, during the Miss WrestleMania 25 Women's Battle Royal at the Showcase of the Immortals in 2009, he dressed in drag and inserted himself into the proceedings. But he wouldn't just insert himself here. No, under the guise of his sister, Santino would actually go on to win the Battle Royal, in what must surely rank as both a high point for him in terms of comedy and a low point for women's wrestling as a whole. And that wouldn't be the end of Santina either, as just 1 month later at Backlash, she'd return to defend her Miss WrestleMania title against Beth Phoenix, something she successfully did, albeit with a little help from the great Khali. Sadly though, after losing to Vicky Guerrero a few weeks after that on an episode of Raw, Santina would decide it was time to hang up her boots for good and retire with an overall win-loss record of 2-1. And that meant from there on in, it was up to her brother Santino to continue on the family legacy, something he continued to do, as by the time his career was over, he'd be a 2-time Intercontinental Champion, 1-time United States Champion, 1-time Tag Team Champion with Vladimir Kozlov, and something of a national treasure in general. Never forget, when times get tough, just do it for him. But while Santino Marella was able to win fans over with his comedy, our next subject took a different route, as when they became a hit, they did so by creating a complete path of destruction in their wake. And that's why it was so surprising to see Kane take such a dramatic turn in 2013, when he started playing the dual roles of Demon Kane and Corporate Kane. Why did Glenn Jacobs decide this was the right time to start showing us all what he'd look like in a suit and tie? Well, because in storyline, it was the point he joined the Authority and took up a role as their director of operations. But even if he was now entering the corporate world fully, that didn't mean he was finished being the Big Red Machine quite yet. And so, whenever the time was right, he would don his old gear and mask and return to being the figure that first started terrorizing the company all the way back in 1997. Sure, it might have been a bit jarring for some viewers to see as they struggled to accept The Undertaker's brother selling out and turning into a corporate shill, but really, it would be more prophetic than any of us realized at the time, as it wasn't long after this that Jacobs went on to enter the world of politics in real life as the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. That said, as the mayor, he's unlikely to ever revert back to his demon incarnation, so his constituents don't have to worry about that in the same way the likes of Daniel Bryan or Roman Reigns did back in the day. Yes, for those performers, Kane's decision to take on double duty only served to make their lives that much more difficult, because when they weren't worrying about the corporate version of him handing out fines or booking them in unfair matches, they were having to worry about the demon returning and laying them out with a well-placed chokeslam or tombstone piledriver. Honestly, while it might not be his most loved period, we have to give this one credit for extending the run of the Big Red Machine by a couple of years, as it gave him something new to work with at a time when it truly felt like there was nothing left to do with the gimmick. Maybe he was taking some inspiration from an old partner of his when he came up with the idea then, as back at the turn of the millennium, Mick Foley was doing the same with not just 2, but 3 characters. It all started with, well, in truth, it started with Dude Love. That was the gimmick Foley created for himself back during his teenage years when he idolized Shawn Michaels. By the time he hit the ring himself, though, it wouldn't be the Dudester he'd be debuting as. No, it would be as the most sadistic man in the industry, Cactus Jack. And this character would see Mrs. Foley's baby boy find a lot of success in places like WCW, ECW, and Japan. But when he joined WWF in 1996, it would be time for a third character to be created for him, with this one being Mankind. Of course, for as great as all 3 of these characters were, no one could have foreseen a situation where Mick would be playing them all simultaneously. After all, who would ever imagine Mean Mark and The Undertaker coexisting, or the Ringmaster and Stone Cold sharing the spotlight? That said, with the Indiana native being who he is, he couldn't help himself from having some fun with the situation. And this was why, starting in 1997, while he was in the midst of playing Mankind, he'd bring back Dude Love and have him appear as a regular character on TV. Then, when this turned out to be a success, he'd go even deeper into his back catalog and revive Cactus Jack for New York audiences too, with him from there oscillating between the 3 for the rest of his career, depending on which one was needed at the time. Hell, at one point he'd actually play all 3 characters in the same match when, at the 1998 Royal Rumble, he memorably appeared as each of them throughout the course of the titular Battle Royal. Really then, you can make a solid argument that this is the best example of someone playing multiple characters at the same time, as not only are we talking about 3 instead of 2 here, but 3 who all had huge levels of individual success and held gold in WWF. But for as great as they were, one thing none of the 3 faces of Foley were able to do was take over the day-to-day running of the company. No, for that we have to move on to our next subject, a man who served a dual role as both a wrestler and on-screen authority figure in the mid-2010s, Triple H. Now, we know you could argue this is the same character, but it really isn't, because more often than not, whenever the game was wrestling, he was very clearly playing the heel, and whenever he was portraying the boss in public-facing situations like meet and greets and press conferences, he liked nothing more than to babyface himself. Of course, it's easy to see why this is. After all, to heel himself up as a representative of WWE would be pretty much healing up the company as well. Still, even if he did like to present himself as the good guy when he was doing the on-screen booking prior to his time in the villainous Authority, it didn't mean he couldn't get dastardly whenever it came time to lace up his boots once more. And that ability to veer between each path so successfully is quite an achievement, as it would be very easy for such an idea to collapse in on itself. After all, we've seen how bad it can get on some other occasions where still active performers have tried to take on managerial roles at the same time. But for the most part, Triple H managed to pull this feat off. Hell, even when he finally did turn heel and continue to be an active in-ring performer, he was still able to do so successfully, as now he was able to be a villain in both cases and really get under fans' skins by doing things like keeping Daniel Bryan away from the WWE title. And when it came time for him to return to the role of babyface authority figure as the figurehead of NXT not long after that, he managed to thread this needle too by successfully being the man who could show up on Raw on Mondays and get booed, all while he was absolutely beloved at Full Sail University on Tuesday nights. Seriously, so good has the cerebral assassin been at this balancing act, he's managed to wash away any lingering stink he had following his infamous reign of terror in the early 2000s, to the point that when he took over as head of creative in 2022, most fans were overjoyed. But let's move away from the inner mechanisms of WWE for a while, and instead focus on a company that once served as something of a competitor to them. Yes, it's time to venture over to Impact, where we find the dual gimmicks of Su Yung and Suzie. Now, for those who aren't regular TNA viewers, Su Yung is the creation of Vanara Riggs and is basically a portrayal of a heelish figure with some kind of mystical powers related to the underworld, basically a play on old Japanese traditions of spirits and ghosts. Of course, given the fact Su Yung is a subject in today's video, you can probably guess at some point just playing this one character wasn't enough for Riggs. And so that was why, while in the midst of a multi-layered program with the likes of Rosemary and Allie, Su was apparently killed off-screen during a match, pitting her against Jessica Havoc. And with that evil side of her character now gone then, it left a path free for Suzie to be introduced over the weeks which followed, with the idea here initially appearing to be that Suzie was another aspect of Su Yung, a more innocent and human one. As time went on though, it became apparent that in one of the most brilliantly ludicrous storylines in modern-day wrestling, Father James Mitchell had somehow managed to retrieve Su Yung from the spirit realm after she died, and then suppressed her memories so that she didn't remember her real persona anymore. That said, eventually bits and pieces of who Suzie really was would gradually come back to her, and this eventually led to Su Yung being resurrected, as she from there proceeded to banish Mitchell to the undead realm himself. But this wasn't the end of things, because even once that was done, Suzie would still appear on TV, with her now being fully aware of who she really was, and terrified of herself as a result, making this the most literal example of a Jekyll and Hyde style character we're going to look at today. And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the third version of this gimmick, which briefly came along in 2021, with that being Suzin, a suit-wearing businesswoman who served as the other side of the increasingly cracked mind of Su Yung. Will there ever be a fourth? Well, that remains to be seen. Either way, we're pretty sure this one will remain in TNA, unlike our next subject, who managed to take an old ECW character and have it work right there alongside his WWE gimmick in 2005. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Simon Dean and his simultaneous run as Hollywood Nova. That's right, before he was everyone's least favorite fitness expert on mid-2000s SmackDown, Mike Bucci had been making waves over in Paul Heyman's Renegade promotion during the 90s as one-third of the BWO. More specifically, he was Hollywood Nova, that group's parody version of Hollywood Hogan, someone who looked great standing alongside the Blue Guy, the Blue Meanie, and Big Stevie Cool, Stevie Richards. But for as fun as this gimmick was, once ECW went under in 2001, it looked like it was going to be dead forever, because WWE apparently had no interest in picking it up and carrying it over to their TV. Hell, when they signed Bucci to a deal in 2002, they'd eventually outright rebrand him as Simon Dean, gym bunny and fitness expert extraordinaire, with his name generally being seen as a rib on Dean Malenko, as the man of 1,000 Holds' real name is Dean Simon. How would Simon Dean fare inside the New York system then? Not great if we're being honest, because with a gimmick like the one that he had, it was very easy to get lost in the shuffle of the Ruthless Aggression era SmackDown mid-card. So thank God he got a chance to redeem himself in 2005 then, as it was here that, upon the announcement of the WWE-booked ECW Revival show One Night Stand taking place that June, he saw an opportunity to bring back an old favorite. Yes, while he was still technically playing Simon Dean over on the Blue brand, Bucci would simultaneously play Hollywood Nova once more on the Extreme show, when at One Night Stand he appeared alongside Stevie Richards and the Blue Meanie. And following the success of this, WWE would even bring the BWO over to the main roster for a while, so that we got a chance to see both characters being portrayed by the New Jersey native, sometimes on the very same night. And the fact that he pulled this off is a testament to how talented he is and how good of a juggler of different gimmicks he can be. Yes, playing multiple roles at once is certainly no easy task, but all our subjects have proved it can be done if you have what it takes.